You can hear me, Phil? Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, and welcome to the Tourism Workforce Insights Survey Key Results webinar. My name is Lynn McDonough with the Nova Scotia Tourism Human Resource Council, and I'll be moderating this morning's session. We are delighted to have Philip Mondor, President and CEO of Tourism HR Canada, with us to present key findings from the Nova Scotia Tourism Workforce Insights Survey, which many of you participated in earlier this year. Phil will also provide a national perspective on the tourism workforce. During this presentation, we will be launching the Council's new Tourism LMI dashboard, which will highlight key areas such as recruitment and retention, and how this information can be used in your operation, as well as how to access research on the dashboard, which is relevant to your region and type of business. For more than 30 years, Phil has worked with labor market stakeholders across Canada and abroad, including foreign governments, pan-global organizations, Canadian and non-Canadian businesses, and various education and training bodies. His work spans over 15 industrial sectors and in 11 countries, with most of his career focused on the tourism industry. Before I pass the mic over to Phil, I'd like to encourage you to post your questions in the chat section to the right of the screen. So now I will pass the mic over to Phil. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's a real pleasure to join you this morning. The information I'm about to present is part of a larger report, and I'm going to try to focus on the highlights particularly. There is a lot of information to cover today, and indeed this PowerPoint presentation and the information will be made available to participants afterwards if they're interested. The report does present key findings of a survey of businesses and organizations that represent tourism industries across the province of Nova Scotia. The work was conducted from December 2021 through to March 2022. And the data gathered was part of a larger survey work done with the other, in addition to the tourism sector, with the other industry sector councils in Nova Scotia. So there is some comparative data here as well that can be looked at. I'll speak to that a little bit later in the presentation. The responses from the 2021 workforce survey formed key input that is going to be available on the dashboard that Lynn spoke to, and she will use some wrap-up comments to speak to that a little bit more. In terms of objectives, the primary research objectives of the survey were to better understand the workforce challenges employers in Nova Scotia are facing today, and how to inform decisions to better manage these workforce challenges. Effectively, there are three areas where the focus was, where we focused. One was on the impacts of COVID. So the impacts of labor shortages due to COVID-19 in terms of businesses and on businesses in Nova Scotia. Also, the recruitment and retention strategies related to a more increased tightened labor market. And finally, some of the training needs in the province to help employers deal with some of these challenges. In terms of respondent profile, we had a good representative sample of tourism employers across the province. You can see that a larger proportion was made up of accommodation, probably indicative or representative of the nature of the industry itself. So it's a good sampling. You'll notice there's a category called Other. This included groups like galleries, historical lighthouse, gift shops, and others. And even in the non-tourism side, some might argue was still tourism, things like suppliers or even a historical church as part of the respondents. There was 193 respondents, which is a very good sampling of the industry and a great place to start with this kind of data collection. This survey, to some extent, could be seen as a benchmark study where you can imagine in the future some additional work being done to see how some of these markers change over time. If you look a little deeper at the respondent profile, most of the respondents, that's 89%, reported that their business or organization experienced peak seasons. So that means, and these are terms that were used in the survey across all industries. Out of these business organizations, nearly half of them, or 47%, had less than 5 employees, 5 or fewer employees. And in 32% of the businesses, all the employees that work during peak seasons are full-time employees, where 16.3% of the businesses, their employees during peak seasons only worked part-time. Nearly 2/3 of the businesses, or 64%, operate during off-peak seasons, and half of those work with 3 or fewer staff. During the off-peak season, 28% of the businesses have 100% full-time employees, while 20.6% have 100% part-time employees. Look, this is a lot of numbers, but the key message here is that the industry does operate with both full and part-time workers. If we look at these numbers on average, we're seeing a larger percentage of part-time than we've seen pre-pandemic, but not too far off in terms of the numbers in Nova Scotia on that front. Finally, one other note here, out of the businesses that operate on an annual basis, 80% of them reported they have less than 6 employees, with currently 55% of them working with 2 or fewer staff. So that just shows you that the pandemic is a real struggle for many at the moment. We are not operating at our full complement of staff. On average in the industry across Canada, operators are reporting that only 50% of staff that they would like to have is what they're functioning with. So we're still very much in recovery modes from the pandemic, and we know this will take some time. Now the next slide is very colorful, so I'd like to warn you before I present it so that you can focus a little bit here, but it's really more than what is necessary. What this does is show you what the participation rate was for the survey across the province of Nova Scotia. Of the 18 counties, there were participants in all of them. Statistically, what you see is a larger percentage of respondents from the Halifax, followed by Lunenburg and Inverness. That said, you can still recognize that the representation by all of the regions are still very useful and very helpful. Compared to other business organizations that experience peak seasons, significantly more businesses in Colchester and Cumberland operate during their off-peak seasons. And we also know from this, from the respondents, that in businesses that operate on an annual basis, over 80% of them over 80% of employees in Digby, Inverness and Halifax all have full-time employees. So there's differences by region, and the report does get into these to some extent, but you can basically see that the blue and purple sections represent the higher percentage of respondents, but also happen to be the regions where there are more representative employees working full-time versus part-time. So that's just a general lens on what we had for survey respondents. And if you think of the data moving forward, it kind of gives you that perspective to draw from. So let's walk through some of these fairly quickly, because I really want to focus more on the recommendations that come out of it. When you look at the respondents, half of the respondents expected the businesses' total workforce will stay the same, and 35% expect an increase in the total workforce in 2022. So there's only a small percentage that could see a decrease. And it was anticipated that 2 positions will be lost in 80% of these businesses. So it looks fairly stable compared to what we're seeing elsewhere, but it does show you that growth potential is somewhat limited compared to what we would have seen pre-pandemic. This is largely due to a limited number of workers to draw from. Nearly half of the respondent businesses, no employees have left in the past year, while 23% of the businesses reported they lost 2 or fewer employees in the last year. The top 3 factors that contribute to these are people returning to school, what's called personal reasons, which could mean a lot of different things, and COVID. COVID-related issues are fairly diverse in terms of the number of issues there. For example, some of them are just fit into a category of high risk, and so can't take on the risk of getting COVID, or they live with someone who is high risk that they're worried about bringing COVID into the home. They're dealing with having to care for people. They may also simply have issues with other kinds of conditions that COVID presented, like lack of transportation and other factors. So the COVID factor is a big one, no doubt. It'll probably wane over coming months, but nonetheless will be a persistent challenge. Looking at this slide here, there are differences. We start to see differences across the different industries, particularly from a seasonal kind of point of view. But out of the business and organizations that operate on an annual basis, 40% of them have job vacancies currently, ranging from 1 to 10. And out of the business organizations, or organizations that operate on a seasonal basis, about 49% of them have job vacancies for their peak season. So this is just carrying forward on some of the notes I had in the previous slides, that although businesses see demand and they would like to increase their workers, they are struggling to find those workers or to retain them. This is the averages of the industry overall, but again, by the different regions and by some of the, whether they operate seasonal or not, does vary in terms of the analysis. Some have greater challenges than what are described on the slide, some less. If you look at the overall recruitment challenges, the survey did ask a lot of different dimensions on this. I'm highlighting for you the top 12. There are, in fact, other factors, but it does show you what looks like across the sector. The most common recruitment challenge that contributed to job vacancies are the difficulty in finding labor in local areas. So this is not new as a challenge in Nova Scotia, especially because a lot of tourism is offered in rural and remote areas as well. And there's just a finite number of workers to draw from as the labor market continues to tighten. That's not surprising then that some of the other top indicators here are really a reflection of some of those same variables. It's not just the numbers, but it's also the skills. That's what the second 49% would basically infer. And then, of course, there are competing interests by other industries. just really is speaking of the tight labor market that exists across the province. It plays it a little bit different in rural areas compared to urban, but nonetheless, the challenges are similar. When asked what kind of recruitment strategies has your business used to try to reduce these vacancies, these again are some of the top measures. The survey did have additional other measures that are not on the screen. They just ranked too low. In fact, the stuff like outsourcing work or moving production to other countries didn't rank whatsoever. Perhaps that's just indicative of the nature of the sector. You can see the top 4 indicators, though, on strategies that were employed by the industry. And when I reflect on those, to me, they look similar to what we would have been doing, again, pre-pandemic, currently, but it does speak to some need for us to up our game on a number of other strategies if we're going to be competitive. And we'll come to that again in a future slide. When you look at recruitment strategies to reduce vacancies, these are also some of the employed strategies. And again, you can see some of the top ones. Personal contacts and referrals have always been the strongest. And of course, people are starting to employ a few other activities, mostly reliant on online boards for posting. Moving forward, this is just a way to illustrate and scale. These circles are relative to the scale of the common retention challenges that the businesses reported. The most common retention challenge was contributed to the difficulty in being able to retain qualified labor. Again, the competition for workers is stronger than it has ever been in a tightening labor market. And with our businesses unable to secure permanent full-time employment or more precarious situations as we were limited by restrictions and constraints, it meant that a lot of workers moved on. So when you look at those larger circles, basically it's a narrative about the challenges we face as an industry because of COVID constraints and restrictions. Some of these will change as those are lifted and as public services start to increase, but it gives you an idea of some of the key retention challenges. If you look at strategies to counter those challenges, these are the things that are reported by businesses in the sector. Again, when you look at some of the measures, these are similar strategies that businesses employed pre-pandemic, but an indicator that went up significantly was on the wage front. Increased flexibility and work culture factored high. Some other reflection we have about this, by the way, is that when you start looking at what's happened across the economy and what workers start talking about as what they're looking for in workplaces, they start talking about things like flexibility, work culture, growth opportunities. These are things that our sector has always been able to offer. They weren't always seen as assets necessarily, but now they're becoming key differentiating factors to compete for workers. So we're starting to see more focus on those as we see in Nova Scotia here, but those are opportunities to build on. Wages are something that you're going to have to learn to compete with more as well. And really the narrative around wages has to do with making sure it's competitive and with commensurate kinds of employment in those regions. We do need to up our game on wages, perhaps a discussion for another day, but we are seeing incremental increases there. What we're also noticing is that they're maybe not as competitive as they can be. They're mostly tracking with inflation, and that's not necessarily competitive to what other industries are doing. So when we asked what degree of labor shortages are having a negative impact, you can see there's a bit of a range here, current versus what they projected for summer of 2022. The short message here is that labor shortages have had a negative impact on almost 42% of the respondent businesses, and the ability to operate currently is hampered by the fact that they don't have enough workers. 47% of them indicated that their ability to operate during the summer of 22 would be constrained by the fact that they don't have enough workers. If you look beyond this, questions were asked about benefits. Now, I might add that the survey itself asked specifically about benefits for frontline employees. It did not get into the kinds of benefits you might offer for other workers. Management, operational people perhaps fit into those categories. That said, these are some of the options that the survey polled. There indeed are other options as well, but the biggest indicator in this sector was paid vacation days. The other things you see on here are fairly normal offers that we've seen in the industry over time. If you compare this to other industries, I think you would see that they do have other things around group health and paid sick leave that might be a little higher than what we're seeing here. But it is something to pay attention to because it's a question of our competitiveness. If you look at perks and incentive, again, specifically for frontline employees, the survey asked, not all other employees. This is how it ranks in terms of the top items: discounts, bonuses, flex time, and pooling. These sorts of things are indicative of our sector, perhaps more than other industries, and are often seen as perks. We're going to have to up our game in some of these areas. Perhaps what was most revealing about the data, from my point of view, was stuff that did not rank very high. There were other indicators other than what you see on the screen, but housing, for example, ranked at only 6.7%, and childcare assistance ranked at 0. Knowing the challenges we're facing in our sector, these factors alone have become really strong narratives on the policy front, because we know that we're losing workers or we're not able to attract them largely because of lack of housing or supports like childcare. So from a policy point of view, these might be areas where some particular focus will need to go if we're going to remain competitive, particularly in very urban centers or in very remote regions. Another area of the survey had 15 indicators, a lot of data. I extracted just the top 8 in terms of how they were ranked. And here is where we start to see even greater differences across different tourism industries and regions. But to generalize, when asked about the kinds of strategies that could be easily implemented and on a scale of agreed to strongly agree, basically these are the way it was ranked. Now, I only captured the agree plus strongly agree combined and the top rankings of what businesses felt they could employ in terms of tackling some of the shortages. So you see that partnering with educational institutes ranks very high, as does training and flexible work arrangements. I can tell you from other survey work that those are very fundamental factors that help contribute to attracting and retaining workers. The education slant here is a big one. And the fact that our industry can offer employment opportunities that enable people to grow their resumes and gain skills is really important. Playing that up will make a big difference. But it does speak to something else that's showed up, and that is the need for more direct work with public education and training in terms of alignment with programs. Now, there's a lot of differences that we see across the different tourism industries here, too much for me to speak to in today's presentation, but the report itself does get into differences between, say, accommodation, food and beverage, recreation, or the travel services sector, where these numbers rank a little differently, but show you where the emphasis lie. So these are general numbers across the sector overall. The trend generally, though, is similar. I want to add that there's one little indicator in here that I wanted to highlight. And although it ranks a little bit lower than one of the top ones, the idea of sharing employees with other businesses, we are starting to see as a growing phenomena because of the tight labor market. So these practices are going to be worth tracking. And if you as an employer are not doing these, it might be something to start looking at carefully. There is really something we're calling like the plus model, where anchor teams plus contingent workers plus shared employees are really what businesses are going to have to look at to fill their complement. So we're starting to see some of that trend shift already in the province of Nova Scotia. And this would be one of those indicators where about a quarter of the respondents are starting to share employees. We would not have seen that 3 or 4 years ago. When looked at the question of do they have capacity to provide training, the good news is that there's a very high percentage of businesses that declared that is the case. And so the culture is there, the interest is there, and acknowledgement that this is a key way to attract and retain workers. The greatest challenges in retaining workers are what you see on the screen here. Again, there were other indicators in the survey work, but I collected the top ones. The biggest one, though, of course, is the instability we've had with our businesses, with the opening, the closing, the constraints on our businesses, all pandemic related, meant that we were unable to provide stable hours or stable paychecks. So that was a real strain and a real challenge for us. Other factors follow. You can see that the challenges are all over the place in terms of helping with HR practices and capacity. That's not surprising since many of the business have 10 or fewer staff and they're small operations. So it's a real challenge when you're operating with small teams and have a lot of other areas of concern. So these are all good indicators of where investments can be made in terms of supports to help employers. And we'll get to that with some of the recommendations. Finally, the survey did ask about initiatives to promote further equity, diversity, and inclusion. This, of course, is a key question because we know that moving forward, diversification of the workforce is necessary. It always has been. This industry has been more diverse than most industries in the economy overall. But the game moving forward is even further diversity. And that includes focused on certain demographics in particular, but not exclusive of all others. So businesses and organizations we know typically do encourage individuals from underrepresented communities, and more of this is going to have to happen, but it does speak to additional supports. Nearly 3/4 of respondents, or 75%, confirm that they do not have activities for their employees to self-identify. So we're not even clear of the level of diversification in industry per se. And most respondents agree that their businesses will and are open to promoting further diversity and inclusion. So that speaks to more data collection, but more supports and indeed a better tracking on understanding how well we're doing on this measure. So with that in mind, we start moving into what does that data tell us and where does it lead? There are indeed a number of opportunities and insights. What we start to see when you look at the data is that regional analysis matters greatly. Although there are some broad indicators across the sector, there indeed are differences by regions and by sectors. The report gets into some of those details. For today, I'm going to stick to some of the broader comments. And here lies some of the key insights, if you like, and opportunities. So in terms of opportunities, there is an openness to doing much more to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion, and an awareness and understanding that this has to be prioritized. The other item we know for sure is that there is a strong push to deal with more ongoing advocacy and public awareness, particularly because we need to overcome negative perceptions, particularly those that we acquired over the last 2 years with reputational damage as a result of the instability in our sector. There's much work to be done on this front, and it involves an all of sector and all of government approach. We know that this industry is well poised to take on new partnerships. It's one differentiating factor that the industry can build on, particularly with education and training providers, but with other community-based groups like settlement agencies, career development organizations, and others that have workers, a potential supplier or network to job seekers. Those partnerships become very important in terms of labor market strategies, and equipping businesses with tools to help forge those partnerships and work at a community level become an important part of the narrative moving forward. Similarly, those organizations need better tools and supports to connect with employers. We also see, as part of the opportunities to build on, is around skills training. The sector did speak to a lot of good tools and practices and the need to essentially accelerate what they're doing. It also is an acknowledgement about the need to shift in terms of the kinds of skills training being offered, acknowledging that there have been significant changes in the labor market, and also to attract workers with the kinds of skills that are coming in, the skills mismatch that they need to respond to. But the good news is that there are tools and there are systems out there to start building on that. So it really is about ramping up the kinds of supports and culture to help with that. Business innovation also came up through the creation of new products and service offers. This is an acknowledging that the sector has had to change. It has had to, the words were often used, to pivot. This is because, of course, to be more resilient and to overcome future disruptions, there was an acknowledgement of investment in things like digitalization, but also to look at different kinds of markets, to try and extend seasons, to try to learn to work with fewer workers. All of this speaks to innovation and change in operations, basically investments in products and services, which translates into needs for further skills and support. But this is all strengthened building opportunities. The sector is well poised for these activities, but now it really is about the kinds of tools and supports or investments that are necessary to help them build on these strengths. When we get to recommendations, there are many. To do this, we felt that it was important to provide a bit of a framework, one that could be used over time and measured against when looking at the investments from not just this survey, which was a bit of a benchmark, but in future tracking of progress around these activities. The way to look at this, we felt, was to focus on three primary categories, which is where most of the challenges will fall that were tracked. One was around the short supply of workers and a need to build a more reliable supply. The other is around skills mismatches. We know that up to 40% of the workforce do not have the skills commensurate with demand. This is speaking to low productivity, but also burnout and turnover. And of course, there's the third category around mobility and employment barrier. That includes matters like housing, transportation, or even the way credentials are recognized and other factors. So when you look at the challenges the industry is facing, for the most part, they fall into these three broad categories. So tackling them can be looked at through that lens, but it is also acknowledging that this is an all of sector and all of government approach. So the actions that we need to take are not singularly held with any of us. There are activities or actionable items for what we will call policymakers, for organizations and advocacy groups, for employers, and for really private and public education and training providers. They're all important. And a level of cohesive strategy around this matters. Finding what we also know to be very pragmatic about this, we're recommending in the framework that they look at short, medium, and long-term strategies. Can't do it all at once. And indeed, these things are going to adjust over time as more investments are made and more policy is changed. So with that in mind, and drawing entirely from the findings of the survey so far, there are some key directives that are being recommended here, and I'll break them down quickly. So on the policymaker front, on the short term, we narrow right down into review and adjust immigration policies. This is a laser-focused interest because we know that new Canadians or immigrants are going to be a key supply of workers for us long into the future, and one of the early supplies we can tap into. But it does mean that there needs to be some adjustment to current immigration streams, both at the federal and provincial level. And although there's been some movement on that front, there are a lot of other adjustments we could see that could benefit the sector. So moving on, that helps address the short-term need to start getting workers into the pipeline today. The second key short-term we see here is to increase investments in particular targeted supply of workers. Here, this is largely underrepresented group and Indigenous populations, for example, where if the right investments were going to the right target groups, we could start to see some immediate supplies there. In the medium term, investments in job-ready programs we know are a big win. Many of you might know of the Ready to Work program that operated for many years, or versions of it. That program, bar none, has been most successful in connecting job seekers with employers and building long-term commitments, or a stickiness, as we say, with those jobs seekers and employment in the sector. It's also done a lot to elevate people's, help them with career trajectories to grow from frontline to to management and even operational roles. So bringing back that kind of program and growing it, we know, is a big win for everybody. It's an all of industry approach. It involves all of community approach as well that's tailored. So we see the need to focus on those investments moving forward. And they must be sustained investments. In terms of the long term, of course, you could see what we have in mind there. A dedicated immigration stream for tourism is something from the national level we've been looking at closely, and acknowledge that it's fundamental, even with all of the investments we've talked about, both in short and midterm here. The reality is it will not be enough to meet the demands. Currently, our projections through to 2025 show we'll have a shortfall of well over 400,000 workers for our industry, with a growing gap. So we need other channels, and a dedicated immigration stream, because of the unique nature of our sector, is one that we're focused on and we know is important at a provincial level as well. And in terms of long-term as well, there are more resources that need to go to promoting and marketing tourism as a destination for careers. And here we see a fairly comprehensive program that targets not just job seekers, but also helps with retention with workers. There's a battery of tools we see for employers, and most importantly, a very large body of programs and supports for what we call influencers and intermediaries, like the education sector, like career development practitioners and others, who can help prepare workers and direct them to our sector, and then help employers better integrate those workers. So there's lots to be done on the policy front that will better align with our interests in the long term as well. When we move on to labor market organization and advocacy groups, the key interest here is increased advocacy. There are a lot of different ideas around that. They are a direct reflection of the comments I made on the last screen, but I cannot stress enough the importance of the advocacy role. Associations like Tie-ins, for example, this is what they've been doing on behalf of the industry, and it's made an enormous difference. They also are helping arm businesses in learning how to speak to their local MP, for example. That does contribute to the advocacy strategy overall. In the midterm, we need to focus on sustained resources, and again, promoting careers and jobs, and finding in the long term really a much more specific and targeted program that's around a comprehensive diversity and inclusion strategy. Now, the only reason that's in the longer term area is because there's more investment and work necessary to produce the kinds of tools and supports to start working with a greater diversity in our workforces, particularly for vulnerable populations that are underrepresented. If that could be accelerated, it could be defined more as a midterm activity. On the employer front, a key theme that shows up, of course, is adaptive HR practices. And I might add that we have seen a lot of change needed in here. There's just new types of phenomena that businesses are not familiar with, have not worked with, and there are indeed further changes occurring. There's a few highlighted in the report, but there's much more we could add to that. And part of this is really about the role of employers in the community. And I spoke to that briefly before, but those partnerships and the engagement in the community matters a lot to becoming a destination of employment interest. There's recruitment strategies that need to be tackled. And of course, there's also work around looking at how businesses start to invest in other operational changes that enable them to work with a tighter or a more lean workforce. Now, on this front, we didn't get any more detailed on this. I mean, based again on the survey findings, this is what we could extrapolate. But I really needed to add here that there's been work done at the national level on this very question. There are many, many other examples and tips for you to tap into. The ones highlighted by the research are included, but there are others. And this is available through Tie-ins and the Nova Scotia Tourism Human Resource Council as well. But it builds on the kinds of things we saw, and it does help for employers to tackle some of the immediate needs they may have. So with that in mind, the last category here is around private and public education and training. And really the focus is on realigning the kinds of programs to meet current demands. Greater flexibility, updated kinds of education and training, more direct engagement with employers, more integrated kinds of programs that are with workplaces where students can start getting into work more quickly. So this is a lot of reform happening, and some of this is already in moving, but the thing we're trying to stress here is working with industries to help design these things closely. One of the last long-term things that we've added, which is something to consider, is expansion of the kinds of programs that are made available. The programs in the province are solid in terms of what they're representing, but there are segments of the industry for which there is very little or no kinds of education and formal programs. So perhaps there's a demand for that, and more work would have to go into looking at what that looks like. So, I know I'm being fairly brief here and really just skirting over a number of the things that the survey work tells us. I'm just going to wrap up my comments before I hand it over to Lynn to say, this is a really great place to start. These indeed are fundamental workforce insights. And the fact that this kind of survey was done with 14 of the industries in the province, there's some rich data here to start building on. We think of this as a kind of benchmark study, one that you can look back on in a year and 2 years from now as more data is collected to look at what it looked like today compared to what it will look like a year and 2 years from now with those investments and strategies once they're deployed. We know that this information matters greatly. It is really about informing policy and programs and investments. And I don't just mean from a government point of view, but really from a business point of view, from associations, and all of these sort of academic and education bodies. The more that we start to analyze this and connect it to the different responsibilities we have as an industry writ large, the stronger we will become as we move forward and tackle our challenges over the next 2 years and beyond. Finally, I want to add one other note here for those that may not be aware, but currently the federal government is undertaking a comprehensive review of the needs on tourism labor issues across Canada. This research information and recommendations could be fodder to help feed into the kinds of inputs that they're looking for with written submissions. But it's also for you as industry players to think about what you might supply as your submission in terms of suggesting where investments could go. So the tourism growth strategy is currently in play, and there's until July 20th to offer your insights to the federal government. I'm hoping many of you feel armed with this data to do so. And again, it's only part of what's in the dashboard, which I'm now going to hand over to Lynn, who could tell you a little bit more about that dashboard, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. First, we have a question from Candace. She's wondering how we can reach the policymakers to make changes such as allowing international students to work more than 20 hours per week, or giving access to employer grants to help pay international employees.
Thank you. It's a perfect question, and I'm glad it's been asked. This is I guess it's all about understanding how we can influence policy change, particularly with federal or provincial government-led initiatives. The good news is that this industry has a very strong advocacy network, both at the national and provincial level. Those organizations are well equipped to present the cases and offer recommendations on behalf of the industry. For example, in Nova Scotia, Tie-ins, of course, takes a lead role in helping with the advocacy work on behalf of the industry. And Tie-ins works directly with the national groups like the Tourism Industry Association of Canada, the Hotel Association of Canada, ourselves, and others. So there is a collective strategy that's in play currently where we're all working together to produce a common narrative, a common ask on these issues. So I guess the basic message here is make sure you let Tyans know what you are asking and what is being recommended. The two examples that were raised, I know are on the table already. And the more that this is known, the stronger that the case is built. And then the second point that I think is very important is that although those advocacy bodies are well equipped and very smart at doing this work, it also matters to do this at the grassroots level. I cannot stress enough the value and the importance of also meeting with your local MP and telling them the same thing. Because in the end, when the MP hears it from you, it matters. When they're listening to the larger policy change from a government lens, they're going to recall that it's their constituents that are asking for this. So it's really a two-pronged approach. And that's really the way it's been very effective for us in the last 2 years. And I must say that having worked with a number of other industries, there's no question in my mind that this industry is better equipped and more organized on this front. So, if nothing else, put your hands in, trust the work of Tyans and just continue to let them know what your interests are, and it will make a difference. So that's a long answer, but I think it's an important one.
Thanks, Phil. Ivan Delgado is wondering, is there any chance we have more tourism programs running in some, that's, guess this isn't really a question for Phil, but it's about having more tourism programs running in some other areas other than Halifax or Dartmouth, which we do have tourism programs running in rural areas. So that might be something that we can discuss later, Ivan. Okay, any other questions? I'm going to talk just briefly about the dashboard. So what we have done provincially is all 14 sector councils, we've developed a LMI dashboard, labor market information dashboard, and collected information from the survey that some of you participated in and that Phil has just highlighted, and collected and put it into a dashboard that highlights some key information from all of the sectors. So that would cover areas such as attraction and retention, diversity and inclusion, wages, and a number of other areas. So you can actually go on, and if you just wanted to look at the tourism industry and see seasonality is also another area, and just look across the board in tourism. That's one way you could look at it. Or you could also compare those different areas with other sectors and compare how we are doing compared to them. So it's actually really, really good in terms of people that might like some information and take a look and see how tourism is doing compared to other sector councils, how we are in terms of wages. Do we pay more? Do we pay less? What are our seasonality versus other sector councils? So we aren't presenting on that today, but we will, we certainly, okay, just want to make sure there wasn't a question I was missing. What we will be doing is when I send out the PowerPoint information from Phil's presentation, I will also include the link to the dashboard, and that way you can all take a look at it. If you have any questions on it, you can reach out to us here at the council, and we would be very, very pleased to help you out with it. We're really excited to launch it. So really, this is the official launching, you might as well say, here on this webinar, because we've been doing little teaser pieces, but we haven't officially done anything yet. So that will be included in the links that I send out to you. Encourage you to check it out. Like I said, contact us if you have any questions on it, and we're happy to answer that. But before we wrap up, just want to see if there's any other questions. do not.
Lynn, if I could add
Yeah.
one thought, look, I probably should have done a better job really expressing how exciting it is to see this kind of data and what it means to work with it. I know the power of having information and what it really can do to change what's happening in terms of us responding to this crisis. We have a very small window here to harness what we know we can build on, but to help influence what we need to see as changes in terms of policy and programs. So this data is a great place to start. You know, it's one survey that started to get a glimpse at what the conditions are and what the needs are. But if we don't do something with it, and if we don't build on it, it's just going to be a lost opportunity. So I encourage people to look at this with very sort of sage thinking and to imagine where the possibilities are, but to ask more questions and to think about what other stuff they need to know. The dashboard will give them some of that information, but there is other information. Of course, we're contributing to these sorts of exercises and partnering with the Nova Scotia Tourism Human Resource Council and with the national work. There's a lot more we can put on the table to inform where people need to go. So, you know, I challenge people, look at this, beg the hard questions, ask for more stuff, use it as a launching pad. And if we do that successfully, we'll start to see results. Hopefully a year from now, 2 years from now, when there's a chance maybe to repeat this or to look at it slightly different, we'll have seen some progress. But please, please don't just put it on the shelf. Don't forget about it today. It's time to act, and we all need to engage with this issue, or we will just find ourselves continuing to fall behind other industries who are benefiting from attracting workers in a tight labor market, and it's going to get more challenging for us. So it's time to change our game, and I hope everyone sees the opportunity.
And somebody asked if it's accessible for everybody, and yes, it is, definitely.
We're also happy to answer questions as people work through this. So don't hesitate to send them, you know, through, you know, to Lynn or and the team, and it'll come to us as well. So engagement is key. Just keep asking. We're here.
Okay, Carol, thanks. We won't eat the summary. And okay. I think that is.
So happy Indigenous Day to everyone. I hope you all have a great summer. It's going to be a wild summer for all of us.
Okay, Phil, so thank you once again for joining us this morning and sharing the wealth of information. We hope you all found it important and that you'll check out the information on the LMI dashboard. And again, to add to Phil's point, you know, everybody's been asking for labor market information, and we have it for you now in an easy to use dashboard. So please don't hesitate to access it. The PowerPoint will be made available to participants, as will the link, and I'll send that out to you this morning. And this webinar has been recorded and it will be available on Tourism Strong later this week. So I thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.